All right. I declare open this hearing of the Senate Economics Legislation Committee for the inquiry into the currency restrictions of the use of cash Bill 2019. The Senate referred this inquiry to the committee on 19 September 2019 for report by 7 February 2020. As of 3 December 2019, the committee has received a total of 2,659 submissions, emails and written correspondence to the inquiry. The committee has published 147 submissions on the committee website that directly address the provisions of the bill. Due to the large number of submissions with recurring themes presented via a number of email mailing campaigns, the committee resolved not to publish every item it received on its website. Instead, the committee has published a selection that represents the recurring views expressed by submitters. The committee is keen to reassure submitters that it has read and examined all submissions and correspondence to the inquiry, and while they are not all published, their themes will be referenced and discussed in the inquiry report, alongside discussions regarding those submissions that directly address the provisions of the bill. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made, although the committee may determine or agree to a request to have evidence heard in camera. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the grounds upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, witnesses may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be made at any other time. Witnesses should speak clearly and into the microphone to assist Hansard to record proceedings. If you agree to provide answers to questions taken on notice during the hearing, please note the answers are due by Friday, 10 January 2020. I would ask photographers and camera people to follow the established media guidelines and the instructions of the committee secretariat. Please ensure that senators and witnesses' laptops and personal papers are not filmed. I ask everyone to please switch off or turn to silent their mobile phones. And we begin today with officials from the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I remind officials that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state or territory should not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and should be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I'd like to invite you to make a brief opening statement. Before we do, could we please just get your names and the capacity in which you appear for the Hansard record, please?
So Dr. Craig Latham, I'm Deputy in the Office of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman.
And Alexandra Hordern, Director of Advocacy in the Office of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman.
Great. Thank you very much for being here today. And as I said, would you care to make any opening remarks?
Yes, just a very short one. So thank you for the opportunity to address you on this, I think, really important issue. And I'll keep it very short. So we support anti-cash economy measures because it creates a level playing field for all businesses. But we have some issues with this particular measure, the cash payment limit, basically around three things. We haven't seen the evidence that this is a real issue, and unclear whether the bill, to the extent that there is an issue, addresses it. And this is especially because it tackles the form of the transaction, not the substance. And also, I think, assumes that cash is just being used to avoid scrutiny anyway, when it's actually used for legitimate purposes. The second is that it creates red tape for small business and disrupts those legitimate transactions. And the third is that small business is already stressed with its operations, since the small business operators, the bookkeeper, the HR, the legal person, the counsellor, and all the rest that goes with operating a small business, making them the cop on the beat as well is another unfair impost on them. And the example, and you can come up with any number of examples, I think, of where a legitimate purpose of using a substantial amount over $10,000 of cash could happen. If you're a cafe, middle of Melbourne, your coffee machine blows up, we need a machine now. how do you do that? And so the transfer of monies between accounts will take time. The transfer then of that money to the person you're buying the equipment from will take time, whereas cash just cuts through that and would be used in a legitimate way in those sorts of circumstances. And that's where I'll stop.
No worries. Just a quick one to start from me. Have you received communication from the small business community about this issue, or is this? Have you just had a look at the legislation and?
So we've looked at the legislation and talked generally about it, but we haven't had people, as far as I'm aware, writing to us specifically on it.
So, Senator, we do engage heavily with the small business community through a policy forum, which consists of 29 industry bodies that represent small businesses, and this is one of a number of issues that we talk about with them on a regular basis.
So, do you know? Have they raised this issue proactively with you, or did you raise it with them?
I'm unsure which way it went,
Okay.
but there have been conversations with our peak body partners to discuss this issue.
All right, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thanks. So, taking your example of the coffee machine, I think even if transactions are split, but cumulatively they come up to in excess of 10,000, they're also capped in, aren't they? Yes. So you could pay 6,000 on Wednesday and 5,000 on Friday to the same supplier, and you've breached the 10,000. That's correct?
That's our understanding of it.
So, is there any evidence that people are using these cash payments to avoid GST payments?
And this is exactly, as I said in the opening statement, we have not seen that evidence.
And you've had consultation with the ATO and Treasury, or?
Yeah, we've been talking with the Treasury.
They haven't
and the
provided
ATO.
you evidence that says that, look, cash has been used to avoid 10% of GST?
Yeah, that hasn't happened, no.
Okay.
So Senator Gallagher, I just want to point out that the tax office haven't made a submission to this inquiry either, so they've not certainly made any claim that GST is being missed out on as well. I actually don't understand how it is on a bill like this. The tax office has not made a
they might
submission.
have told someone what was going on.
Yeah, sure.
We'll find out later in the day if we can. But so, I mean, a lot of, say, high volume cafe type Melbourne City or Sydney CBD, they might generate reasonable amounts of cash in a week.
Yes.
Is it customary for those small businesses to make reasonably large cash transactions rather than, banking and filing the invoice?
And certainly I could only talk anecdotally on that, so it will depend on the actual business. But again, it's a legitimate form of transaction. So if you're complying with your tax, why shouldn't you be able to make cash transactions if you've got the cash, especially if it on hand, provided you're paying all your tax? Why is this a problem?
So the volume of transactions through the business would still be recorded.
Yes.
And the volume of receipts would be still recorded. So I would have thought it would have been an audit would have revealed if there was any avoidance of GST or the like.
And Senator, that does go to that point about tackling the substance of the transaction, which is what you should be doing, not the form of the transaction.
Okay. And the curious thing I thought when I first read the legislation is that there is, someone inadvertently exceeds the cash value in a transaction and they have an ABN number with another ABN number, they're both gone, so there's no incentive for anybody to put their hand up and say, oh, look, I made a mistake, because if you say that, you're gone as well.
Yeah, and that's certainly an issue that looking at it, the strict liability is a real issue. Because normally, if you did make a mistake, happen to make a mistake, and small business is not trying to make mistakes on this, but mistakes do happen. If you make a mistake on your tax affairs and you come clean to the tax office, you would hope that all penalties would be waived, whereas this does not allow for that because of the strict liability.
Okay, so just to be perfectly clear on that, so if a small business was an ABN, paid $12,000 to another ABN business, realised, and that was a delegated function to a manager or an employee, realised there had been a mistake made, the owner realised a mistake made, who would get the fine? The person who made the transaction or the business?
And I'm certainly not an expert on this proposed law, but as I understand it, both parties are responsible because they shouldn't pay or receive amounts.
Okay, so even if you delegated, it wouldn't be the person who's delegated, it would be the owner of the business.
In that sense, I'd have to have a look closer at the legislation as to exactly who it is, but it talks about an entity, I think, paying or receiving, so it could be quite broad in scope.
Okay. And I think there's some delegated regulation to come after the bill. What are your understandings in that area?
And certainly, yes, and I think the bill references that there will be regulations, or the supporting materials say that. Our position on it is that, look, if there are a need for exceptions, it should be in the legislation itself. It should not be sitting in the EM, subject to somebody's discretion to operate, and it should be there at the time of consideration of the bill, not pushed off to regulation where we don't know the actual form of it. And for such critical issues around a mistake, if that's something that should be out, we believe it should be out, then it should be in the legislation, not pushed off somewhere else.
And is that consistent with other 120 penalty points and or 2 years jail type legislation?
Consistent with other measures that do the similar sort of thing. Again, I'm not across all other measures, but I find it difficult, because of the seriousness of the offence, that any exceptions are not built into it, because they're critical to the proper operation of it.
Okay. Who'd police this? I mean, would we have a policeman coming around checking your books, or would we have a taxation inspector or a treasury official? What would happen with your auditor?
And how do you even spot it as well? So how would you even spot this happening, even if it did happen?
So what if your auditor picked up that you'd done it a couple of times during the year? Would he be bound to disclose?
So auditors, accountants are under their professional obligations. Whether or not they would be bound, and that question would need to go to an auditor or an accountant to be able to confirm it. But certainly the professional obligations of lawyer, other professions, would mean that you're under obligation not to lie.
So who would you ring?
Well, the ATO, I would imagine, would be looking at this, as you'd suggested, on audit. They'd need to be able to pick it up through their systems.
So the ATO would be administering this penalty?
That would seem to be the case based on the legislation.
And would they be, has anybody sort of said how it would actually work? Would they do, inspections of businesses?
Yeah. I'm not aware of any clarity around that at this stage. The ATO does do spot audits of businesses and educational visits to businesses, and this may be something that comes as part of that, but that's really a matter for the administering organisation.
But it's not going to appear on any books. If someone is doing something unlawful, one would think that you don't do something unlawful and then put it on your books. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, does it?
Yes, Senator, there is a real question there. Yeah. So, and that goes to the form versus substance. So if your substance is a bad substance, you're not going to put it through your bank account. Yeah.
So if we go back to the splitting the transaction, what if the transaction was 6,000 3 months earlier than the next, but it was the same, for the same thing to the same entity? Would that break the law?
So my understanding of it is it picks up the GST linked provision rules, and so it would be subject to that. And so I'd have to look at the particular circumstance to be able to determine that. But that's the sort of thing that does concern me about this, that it does pick up linked transactions. And you as a business person, you're thinking, I'm fine because I'm under the $10,000 every time, but you're not thinking, oh, but I've got another one coming up that I've committed to pay, for example.
Okay. So what is the extent of the black economy in small businesses? Is it something that you're across, or has anybody said, oh, it's this big or that big?
So internationally, people, and these are governments, struggle with even being able to tell what the amount is. Because it's a cash economy, you don't get to see it. You get to sort of observe it from other things happening in the economy, probably observe it, but getting a handle on it is exceedingly difficult.
And I'll finish on this. So, I mean, the obvious example to me is if a tradesman's come to your house and you don't need a receipt and you've got some cash in your house and you just say, well, how much, if it's $2,000 here, $2,000, see you later. Is that what they're trying to stop? Or
well, Senator, in that situation, we would say businesses, vast majority overwhelming majority are good taxpayers, right? Doing the right thing, trying to do the right thing. So that sort of transaction would say totally legitimate that you pay. It's just a method of payment there on the day. That's a legitimate way of conducting your business. Certainly that sort of transaction that's under $10,000 is not even addressed by this bill, and nor would we say, though, to reduce the limit down. So again, we fall back to it's a legitimate transaction. It's how society has operated for many thousands of years. Why stop this legitimate thing when you're trying to tackle something else?
And just finally, for a small business who did that 5 times or 6 times in a year, would they run foul of the law if they paid $2,000 6 times to the same entity?
Yes, so that comes down to that linked transaction thing, and that's my concern. So that you might be running a market stall or something, paying your rent, you committed to a year's rent, paying over time. That would be my concern, that you get caught. Having said that, look, we would always encourage people, and it's good to be able to pay electronically. It's much easier than handling money, so that's a good thing. But it should be up to the business to decide whether that works with them, because business is all range of diversity.
Excellent. Thank you.
Senator Patrick.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Just wondering whether you've seen the ABC report this morning about the large corporate entities not paying tax. Close to half of them not paying any tax at all. I just wonder whether this bill is targeting the wrong audience.
Senator with the Small Business Ombudsman, so we will comment on, I think, small business matters, but
sure,
I will read with interest that report as well.
Yeah, no,
We'll take that one as comment.
No, sure. Well, can I just add this comment as well? That's ExxonMobil, in the previous 4 years had $33 billion of revenue and zero tax, and now it's with a new tax data that's come out this morning, takes it up to $42 billion of revenue without paying tax, and it just reminds you of that ad where everyone's standing around the barbecue and someone says, "I work for ExxonMobil," and the whole thing stops. But
let's get back to questions, shall
well,
we, Senator Patrick?
I just think that maybe there should be arrests on entry and exit into the country on social crimes for some of these executives. But anyway, going to this particular bill, I just want to understand, right now, if I make a cash transaction as a small businessman making a cash transaction to another small businessman or business, and I don't report that in my books, is that an offence?
Would depend on the transaction, but if it's for a business purpose, so you're paying somebody income, it needs to be recorded. So if it's income,
so already there is an offence in effect if you are operating in the context of a black market by not recording a business transaction on your books.
Yeah, that's correct, Senator. That's the substance, and that's where our view is the law should focus on the substance of a bad transaction, not the form of that bad transaction.
So in effect, there's already a law in place that deals with the sort of conduct. In fact, it deals with that sort of conduct all the way down to a couple of dollars.
Yes.
So it does make you wonder, without any additional enforcement, it perhaps adds something slightly new to the whole gamut of unlawful activity, but it wouldn't seem to be substantive, noting the existing crime.
Yeah, it's blind to the purpose of it. It focuses in on the actual amount.
Now, I've run small business. I've been a director of a company, and when I purchase something from Officeworks or from any particular entity for the purposes of my business, and I pay them, I get a GST input credit, and it's only when I'm selling my own services that, in effect, I get charged the difference between the two. So the way the GST system works is you're not saving 10% because because you have a GST input credit. So it seems to me a little bit confusing that there's necessarily a lot of money in the transaction, because really the point of where the GST is paid is at the point of sale to the final customer.
Yeah, so the GST system is constructed so that it keeps people honest along its way. And yes, you are right that it's at that last transaction that there could be a difference.
So is there any evidence that that's failing? I mean,
This is why
all your goods going out have got GST on it. Everything you pay out, you want to get the credit.
yes, we're not aware of any evidence, and that's the sort of thing that we would really like to be able to see.
So my point is that you would be risking committing an offence for what is not even 10% because of the way in which the GST credit system works.
Yeah. And this is certainly focused at GST, but we also focus at income tax as well as other law.
How many businesses use cryptocurrencies?
I don't know. I can't give you a number on
But
that.
in your
I
context,
suspect no one knows that.
well, but in the context of your interaction with business, I mean, there are certainly cryptocurrencies are being used, and one of the features of cryptocurrency is anonymity. It's built into the way in which cryptocurrency works, and the submission by Treasury suggests that that we're trying to move to a place where there's no there's not a lot of cash transactions, and we all know, paying for services on your mobile phone now or on a credit card, that is the way that things are going. Yeah. But in some sense, I mean, people who are engaging in this conduct, if they want to go off the radar, can simply go to move to cryptocurrency, I would have thought.
Yeah, and Senator, we're not dealing with it. No business that I've spoken to has actually talked about dealing in cryptocurrency, with me at least. Right?
Sure.
So it's anecdotal. But and the only time I've ever really heard about it being used is to pay ransomware.
To pay what?
For ransomware, so when somebody locks your computers and demands a payment in cryptocurrency or other.
But there would be people who work solely on the internet designing programs and the like who would use cryptocurrency. You don't have any...
Yeah, and I'm not aware of those businesses. But
Maybe the committee needs to look at that, because certainly cryptocurrency is a legitimate form of exchange. So, for example, you can cut out the bank, not pay any currency exchange fees and so forth. So for international transfers, it's actually quite a legitimate and sensible way for businesses to conduct transactions.
Well, we can ask the RBA and Treasury about that later on.
Sure.
and that's the same sort of argument we say with cash. It's
Sure.
legitimate as well.
Sure. No, I just wonder whether that's been factored into this, and perhaps it is a question for Treasury. I just thought you might have had an understanding of the extent to which small businesses are using cryptocurrencies. Okay. Now, the other aspect of this is, in some sense, this bill drives people to the banks. You have to have a bank in order to be able to conduct business, and many people in the community aren't feeling that good about banks. So the government is, in fact, forcing people to go to these banks, which have also been accused of having no social licence and have been involved in abhorrent conduct. Is there any view or suggestion that perhaps we need to have an amendment to this bill that says bank charges for transactions over $10,000 are unlawful? Would that be a reasonable thing to do in circumstances where the government forces people to go to banks in order to be able to conduct their business?
Certainly, we'd be very much in favour of any reduction in fees for small business. But Senator, the non-use of banks can happen in other ways too. So you could be a tourist in Australia who doesn't have a local bank account and can't actually pay for the good. But we're coming across a number of situations where banks are actually removing people from their books. So we call it debanking. So, for
You
example,
call it- sorry, what?
debanking.
Debanking,
So not
okay.
offering services.
Sure.
So this could be your point of sale equipment, but this can also be even holding an account with the bank, and it's happening across a number of industries where we've seen. Some of it's news agents, some of it is adult services, and other industries as well. So we've seen examples of people associated with tattoo parlours or gun shops also being debanked as well.
So for social conscience reasons, you're saying, or?
We are having trouble fathoming exactly for what reason, Senator. So
Okay.
why you would try to actually debank legitimate businesses.
So in that respect, it would be quite legitimate for businesses to try and debank banks because they certainly have an awful track record. And the government is in effect forcing people to use these very entities that engage in abhorrent commercial conduct.
I think the key here, Senator, is that if a bank refuses to deal with a particular business and the business needs to make transactions of over $10,000, requiring a business to deal with an entity that won't deal with them puts that business in an impossible position.
Okay, I see your point. That's a very good point. Okay. I think that's it for me.
Can I just ask if you've got any sense of how many of your businesses on this line of banking? I see people tapping for a $3 coffee with a tap and go. Small business, are they? Is there a declining take in cash, or is it still 50-50? Or
Well, anecdotal, but I have observed a rise in that, and it's been especially helpful that they can pass on the cost, the actual cost to them of those transactions.
and I've heard that there are places now which say cash only, like a dry cleaner in Sussex Street might just say cash only. Is there a rise in that sort of activity in small business?
Yeah.
Anecdotally only, we'd be able to comment. Businesses will make decisions if they're not prepared to pay the transaction fees, then they may make those decisions, but...
And they're allowed to do that.
Yep.
To be honest, I've seen more
Yeah,
electronic
card
only.
Yeah.
And they do go both ways. They definitely do go both
There's certainly
ways.
at Adelaide Airport it's card only, but there are certain areas, particularly in Western Sydney, where it's cash only. So tap and go seems to be the prevailing method of payment for a lot of people. So why do we need this $10,000? I mean, how many small businesses we getting, $10,000 or $20,000 in a week and seeking to pay bills with it?
And Senator, yes, we'd agree with that.
We can't see the stats on that.
No. So that's why it really is important to get some of the evidence sitting behind this to work out, is it even a problem? So we don't know if it is a problem and the nature of the problem either. So.
And it's hard to determine, again, if the tax office hasn't made a submission to the inquiry.
They're coming up a bit later, Senator Patrick. Hold your horses. Well, you go with our thanks.
Thank you.
For being here today, and we will move on to the Australian Taxpayers Alliance.